Hello, welcome back to my studio. Today I'm working on a very special painting. This video is going to be a tutorial. I'm going to talk you through my process from start to finish using a still life. But the thing that's really special about this still life photo is it was one of the photos I took for my new book that's coming out. So I'm actually in the process of releasing a book, depending on when you're watching this. Its release date is June 11th, 2024. You can pre-order it now, assuming you're watching this before that date. But I did a bunch of still life paintings for that book because the title of it is Modern Still Life from Fruit Bowls to Disco Balls. It's a sort of more contemporary spin on the traditional art of still life. I feel like still life sometimes can get a rap as being kind of like a boring subject matter, but I could not disagree more, especially in this day and age. I have a theory that we're very much like a stuff culture where things, people, it's hard to go down the highway without seeing storage units. Like, we all grow up with the visual media of marketing and sales and advertising. And so because of that, whenever you look at something like a can of Dr. Pepper, you can immediately sort of think of like loosely the kind of people who might drink that. And then you continue to kind of narrow it down with the accumulation of other products. And I think you can kind of paint a portrait of someone using objects, which is kind of neat. I feel like if you look at the whole expanses of human history, I think maybe to some degree we've always been able to do that, but probably never as specific as we can right now. And, you know, as dystopian as that might be, if you sort of think about it long enough, I think we can sort of take a little silver lining of this and, you know, use the fact that we all know people who identify with certain objects and things and really use it to our advantage. So all that to say, this is one of the reference photos that didn't make the book. A variation of this painting is in the book with step-by-steps, and I wanted to paint this here and now to sort of launch the book and book season. This one has the actual picture of like Misty cigarettes to give you kind of insight into what this painting is about. It's a still life. I'm gonna teach you how to paint a still life, but this was meant to be a portrait of a 2000s mom. It's a little bit my mom, it's a little bit me, it's a little bit the ladies who I grew up in my apartment complex with who smoked Misty cigarettes and drank Dr. Pepper. And so for me, this is sort of an homage to that genre of person, and it is meant to be a little bit of a portrait without actually having a person in it. So if this sounds fun to you, if you want to see how I paint a still life, if you want to hear me talk more about the book and some of the fun things. So with that, let's jump into the painting. If you're interested in seeing how I create a still life and how you can create a portrait using objects, then let's just jump into the video. So I'm gonna go ahead and put the photo on the screen for you right here so you can screenshot it if you want. So first I'm gonna briefly talk about what is a still life while I take off the wrapper of my panel board. I'm just using an ultra smooth gesso panel. I really like using these. They're smooth, there's not a lot of texture, it's just a good surface, but you use whatever's accessible to you. But let's talk about like what is still life. Still life is basically any painting or photo or artwork made out of an array of objects. So there used to be a real rigidity to what the different kinds of paintings were. There was portraits, it was strictly like a picture of a person. You also had like genre paintings, you had religious depictions, you know, back in the day, especially in the Western tradition of art. I'm gonna be speaking to art, but just know that I'm a painter who learned the Western tradition. So sometimes one of my pet peeves actually is when people sort of say some sweeping statement about art when they mean Western tradition of art. Like realism in the West is always going to be sort of grounded in like one point perspective and sort of reference like the camera or like, you know, that very straight on vision. But realism in another part of the world with a different tradition might mean something else. I mean, what is real, right? So anyways, I'm talking about the Western tradition of art. But yeah, there used to be really rigid divides, and still life was kind of towards the bottom. At the top we had our religious paintings, because in the Western tradition of painting, you know, religion and art were symbiotic, so to speak. They were usually, the church sort of was a big patron of the arts, and you know, and that kind of worked like that. So a lot of art for a long time in the West was very inspired by religion. So it makes sense that religious depictions of history work towards the top, followed closely by like mythology, depending on the culture and the time period, etc. And then portraits, because portraits were sort of viewed as this like, you know, depicting the human form realistically was, you know, in various waves in the West, thought of as like a really high form of art. We see this sort of humanist desire to really depict the human form crop up in Europe, and so it was right after the religious depictions. And then towards the bottom is still life. It's an array of fruit, it's objects. And I think the other thing that makes still life maybe a less desired subject is because it's often now used as a teaching tool. And I think it's a great teaching tool, I'm not against that, but I think what ends up happening is we associate it with education and we think that it's only has one kind of singular purpose, and I think it gets slept on a little bit. I will say in the last few years I've seen a resurgence, but whenever I started my Teenage Still Life series, which was like a full headfirst dive into the subject matter, I remember all the questions I would get in interviews and magazines and podcasts would be like, why are you doing still life? And I think luckily enough people are doing it now earnestly and not just for education that it's less of a thing. But even in the creating of this book, when I was pitching the idea and we were talking about it, there was this idea of like, hey, we want you to paint still life. You're very good at it. It's your thing. But we're up against the public view of still life being boring. So how can we remedy this? And hopefully I did a pretty good job. I like to tie in a lot of more contemporary items, but I'll let you guys be the judge of that. So I'm gonna go ahead and go in with an underpainting. I really like to use fluorescence in my underpaintings. Why? You know, I don't like starting on white, but it could be any color and I would be pretty happy. Fluorescents, admittedly, if you're really new, are tough. If you're new to painting and you wanna do an underpainting and you don't know what to do, I would say select a brown or a gray. Whenever I was in college, we started with a medium gray, which is, you know, on the value scale, how light or how dark, right in the middle gray. And that always worked pretty well for me. I've shifted over the years to various neons. I used to do a lot of orange and pink, and I just felt the desire to change. So I started painting with this lime green fluorescent color a couple of years ago, and I really like it. This painting also has a lot of pinks and reds in it, and I like when there's a complement because inevitably some of the underpainting won't be fully covered. Hopefully, that's my sort of one of the ways I prevent myself from overworking a painting. But if I can leave some of that color in there, it won't look overworked, and I think it looks kind of cool contrasted with all the reds and pinks because they are opposite each other on the color wheel. A misnomer is oftentimes people think the word complement, like complementary colors, is like they really complement each other or like they look really nice together, and certainly they can. I'm always a big fan of pink and green. Maybe it's the millennial in me, but I love that combo. But complement actually means complete, which means that two colors that are exactly opposite each other on the color wheel, and I'll just say it's not always like red and green, because green could be this green, it could be olive green, red could be really orangey, or it could be almost like a pinky red. It's really kind of specific to the shade, but all that to say, a perfect pair of red and green, or complements, wherever they are on the color wheel, would be mixed together, and it would create something that's called chromatic gray, which is a gray that should, in theory, be indistinguishable from a gray that you used by mixing black and white, in theory. And that would be true color complements. So, you know, we use complement more colloquially just to mean two colors opposite each other in the color wheel. But it is important to know that opposite colors cancel each other out. I think that that's actually even the more useful aspect of knowing your complementary colors kind of on hand, because if you needed to make, you know, if you were painting a leaf and you had this color green on your palette and the leaf was obviously more of a natural shade of green and not this insane fluorescent color, you would want to know how to keep this still green but make this neutral, and the solution would be to find the shade of red that is opposite of this on the color wheel. If it's a yellowy green, the complement would probably be a like more purpley red. If you mix those two together and just a little bit of that complement, it would eventually bring down the saturation to where it eventually, ideally, got to a more natural green. Color mixing is never that simple, but don't worry, I plan on making so many videos about color mixing. So you will be a master of this shortly, I'm sure. So this will dry, it's acrylic paint, and so it'll dry pretty quick, and I thought I would take this moment to talk to you about my palette. So I love using these Stay Wet palettes for no other reason than they just simply make my paint last longer. And as someone who paints a lot, saved me probably legitimately close to a couple $1,000s at this point. paint is expensive. So, you know, I find that the better strategy than just putting out these teeny tiny little puddles of paint that dry like that is to go ahead and put out these big blobs of paint and then put them in a Stay Wet palette. I will say this particular layout is particularly big blob, but I just finished working on some massive disco balls and that's why my blobs are big. Normally they're about half this size, but this will work for today because usually I will have one of these on my palette, this layout on my palette for 2 weeks. I'll add a little bit to some of the colors I use a lot of, but I can keep this for 2 weeks to a month, depending on what I'm working on. I also have this spray continuous mist spray bottle. These are so handy, especially if you live in a dry climate. There's a balance. You can put so much water in your acrylic paint that you break down the integrity of the paint. You don't want to do that. I think it's like more than 20% can't be water. I find that even that pushes the limit a little bit. You know, you can make a wash, sometimes it works, but you know, generally speaking, I like to keep my water to a minimum. That being said, if you missed it, it keeps from that skin forming on your acrylic paint and you can use it longer. Sometimes if you're mixing something and you need it to stretch just a little tiny bit longer, like this much longer, you can mist it and keep it going. But I would say if you're newer, be cautious about using water, but I will say that that mister is pretty helpful. As far as what colors I have on my palette, I have titanium white, cad yellow light, cad yellow medium. I like to have a warm and cool of each of my primaries, bare minimum for the most part. Pyrrole orange, why do I have that color? I don't usually have orange on my palette. However, I've fallen in love with that color because it is a cool orange, which cool is another term we'll kind of get into. Basically, it pulls more like magenta than it does yellow. And for me, that reads as very cool, but all that to say, then I have 2 cadmium reds. Don't ask why. I think I was trying to use up an extra tube of my cad red light, which I don't use a lot of. And then I have alizarin crimson, quinacridone magenta, dioxazine purple, ultramarine blue, and then I have Prussian blue. I usually don't have that color on my palette except for what I was painting was very dark blue, so I just had it on there. Phthalo blue green shade, phthalo blue yellow shade, ivory black, and a couple of iridescents, which I don't think I'll use. But remember, I had this specifically made for a different project. If I was just working on this, I would probably condense my palette just a little bit. I also have a glass palette. You can use freezer paper. There are so many options, but I like using this. I've used it for years. I think I made it in college or either right when I graduated, I can't remember. And it's just a piece of glass from a large kind of nicer picture frame. I think I thrifted it if I'm not mistaken. I'll take a moment to talk about my brushes. I am a brights and flats girly all day long, which means I like these like square rectangle shaped brushes. You can do a lot with these brushes, so I really like them. Use whatever you want. I will say if you are newer, stay away from like the pointy little pencil brush. The best piece of advice I can offer you is that painting, a lot of times people's mistake is that they want it to feel like drawing when they start, because think about it, you know, assuming that you've gone to school and you write with your hand and you've drawn with your hand, it is so easy and so familiar to want to transfer that knowledge and that hand-eye coordination that you developed from writing and drawing into a brush. And it's going to feel more comfortable at first to want to do this, to really grip it like that. But the quicker you can embrace holding it further back and letting it be a paintbrush and not a pen, which is to say, laying down big, thick blobs instead of trying to illustrate and render like a pencil and like color in like a crayon. The quicker you can sort of get comfortable with that discomfort, the quicker painting will come to you. I see painters all the time who are good illustrators, they're coming from that background knowledge, want to do this, and the minute they sort of switch and embrace, and they can go back to this, you can certainly have brushes and at the end, or you know, maybe even in the drawing stage, utilize it like a pen if you want. But if you don't learn to block in with bigger brush and more in like a blocky, chunky, apply paint kind of way, I find that students tend to struggle. And I'm not trying, and I will say, like, I'm not trying to change anyone's style per se. I'm just saying, from teaching long enough, people who sign up for a painting class because they want to paint, they don't want to illustrate and draw with paint, they're wanting to paint with paint. That's the distinction. So that's why I like these big brushes. I would recommend buying one that's a little out of your comfort zone. Let's say you normally paint on this size. This feels too big. Just play with it. Just try it out. I'm gonna go ahead and mix up a drawing color. I love orange or like a coral color with this lime green. I think it's subconsciously, I love Nickelodeon colors. I don't know why. And so that's coming through. All you need is something that contrasts both in hue, which is like the name of the color, and in value. So how light or how dark. I don't know that these contrast too much. I actually think these are probably pretty close in value. So maybe I'll regret this, but all this to say, the takeaway is that you don't have to be too precious. Just whatever will stand out to you. So typically what I start out by doing is just kind of finding my edges. And then I work in from there. There's so many ways to approach drawing, and I don't think that there's anything inherently better or more moral or better, I can't think of the words, objectively good about being good at sort of drawing for drawing's sake. I have always wanted to get good at that skill, despite what I would consider not being naturally inclined to being a particularly good draftsman, not being particularly good at drawing, because I'm lazy and I would rather have it built into my head how to draw than use tools like a projector or a ratio tool or gridding. I think for me, that's just kind of how I justify it. But again, there's no wrong way of doing this. If you need to create a grid, if you need to use a projector, by all means, do that. I also am not particularly interested in my paintings being super accurate, especially still life. I always kind of liked the game of like, what can I get away with? What looks kind of realistic, but then you get up close and you're like, I don't know that that's correct. So, for this step, I'll just say, do what works best for you. But generally I start working out and then I slowly work my way in. I can already tell, I think my drawing might be a little off, but that's okay. So I have my Dr. Pepper can here. I always do where I like drop verticals. That's just pulling a vertical down over my image, because that does a lot of clarifying. One thing that we tend to do as people, or at least I do, is we over exaggerate the curves of things, and things are actually a little more square than you would think. So by doing a vertical or horizontal, sometimes a line that feels so diagonal, you do that and you're like, oh, it's actually pretty close to horizontal. And just that little data gathering is helpful. I think drawing, sometimes I view it as like, you're just gathering data. And I'm really just kind of figuring out proportions. I'm not really drawing for drawing's sake. What does that mean? None of this drawing, I don't think, will end up showing in the finished piece. I'm gonna go over and kind of cover this up with my initial painting. So I don't need this to look good on its own because it'll be covered. I'm trying to create basically like scaffolding for my painting, or like a rough layout for the painting. Rough is the key word there. And as I go, you will see in my process, I open myself up to more and more opportunity to refine. A magical number for me in painting, and actually maybe even in life, if we can get deep for a second, is like the power of 75%, 75 to 80%, depending on who you are. And sometimes that quest for 100% will kill you in a painting. And, the thing is, like, if I wanted this to be perfect right out of the gate, I would spend 5 days making this, because I know what perfect, I'm an artist. Like, I'm intimately aware of perfect, what does that mean to me? And perfect is a concept that deserves its own video, but I can visualize it in my head. I've made enough good art that I know what really good for me looks like. And so that can be a little bit limiting and kind of scary. But if you just get things to 75%, you're like, well, that mascara looks like it might be off, but it's only 20% off. You can deal with that later. I would say the difference is like, if the whole thing is really wonky, you're gonna have to do everything all over again in the next step. But if everything's 75% and every step you just refine a little, by the time you're doing your real detail work, you're writing out Dr. Pepper, you're doing the graphic on the cigarette, everything is roughly in place enough that you're not making major fixes. And that's kind of what I'm aiming for here. And I believe in, good enough. I grew up with a parent that was very like, my dad's term was always don't have things. Sorry for the bad word, but true to his phrase, that's exactly what he said. And I remember one time as a kid, little kid, I was the oldest daughter, so I did clean the house. And for a long time, I cleaned the house with my dad. My dad and I would just clean the house. My mom worked, and so, you know, her Friday was Thursday because she worked 4/10s, whatever. Anyways, and so Thursdays I'd get home from school and yeah, I cleaned until my mom came home. And one time I remember getting so frustrated at my dad because he spent the entire time that I cleaned the entire house just cleaning out the vacuum cleaner, which is like that joke about like when you clean the vacuum, you're a vacuum cleaner. Anyways, but he was cleaning out the vacuum and I was able to get the whole house done. And he was so keyed into cleaning this one thing. And I remember thinking like, well, he's not being lazy, but he's just not being productive. Like he could have wiped it down with a rag and cleaned out the dust, but he just chose to like hyper focus on like getting every detail, like trying to make the vacuum cleaner look new again. It was very strange. And I remember at that point, like intimately learning, like, you know, sometimes perfect is the enemy of good. And absolutely. And I think that with the painting. And the thing is, you want to have a process where over time you do have the ability to solve something to whatever you consider perfection. But to demand that out of yourself in the beginning when you're just kind of familiarizing yourself with your subject matter, I find is too much of a task, and it can make the painting really daunting and stressful, even if you like the process. Like I love painting, I love being caught in the weeds of a painting, but even still, if I challenge myself to be perfect right out the gate, I am gonna struggle. So it is because of that that I've learned to really appreciate 75%. Okay, so what am I doing here? I'm just sort of checking, you know, making sure my dimensions are good. You know, the left side of the cigarettes cuts up through the purse. That seems right. You know, the end of the cigarettes cuts up through the Dr. Pepper can, so like here. So, you know, I'm just checking things to make sure, again, I know that this isn't all perfectly rendered. But is anything so far off that later I'm going to like have to do some real big movements, like completely cut and paste parts of this painting? You know, it's okay if that happens. You can't be perfect. But to the best of my ability right now, am I setting myself up where future Sari has, you know, a relatively easy go at it? Like, is everything relatively in the right spot? That's kind of, you know, to be honest, where my head's at. And yeah, to me, that feels like a good start. That might look crazy to y'all, and that's okay. Again, scaffolding. You wouldn't, you know, you don't go out in the world as a skeleton. You have all this stuff on top of your skeleton, and that's how you go out in the world. And you have clothes on top of that. So, you know, it's like this. Like, this is the skeleton of my painting. So, you know, it's important that it's there. It's the foundation. It's the structure. Everything will ultimately come back to an answer to, but I'm not gonna show this out in public like this, you know? So it doesn't have to look pretty, it just has to be helpful. I always think of this step as it's just setting up, you know, the foundation for future Sari to make better choices when she goes in and does the block in, which is where I will do my value and my color choices. So then, you know, then I have an easier go because the drawing's already relatively mapped out. I will say the nice thing about working on a glass palette is I can just kind of scrape up this paint. And so we want to select a brush that's relatively big, right? You know, it's like, if you haven't worked with a big brush, this will feel ginormous. I'm always thinking like, can I block in? And this is perfect. In fact, you could probably go bigger. My general rule when I'm teaching in person and I'm telling people to use a bigger brush is pick one size up from what you consider kind of a big brush. I know, so you might be painting with like a house painting brush, that's fine. You'd be surprised what you can do with a big brush. Remember, you can blob with the corner, you can draw a straight line, and certainly you can block in. That's pretty versatile for a brush, all things considered. Okay, so the first thing I'm gonna do is my darkest value, and I do have quite a bit of darks in here. Just a refresher, what is value? Value is just how light or how dark something is. So the dark values in this particular painting, I have a lot of like dark red, some maroons, some burgundies, some dark browns. I don't know that I have any true blacks. The text on the perfume bottle and the screen on the Motorola that's in the shade is black. But one thing I always do is I'm always really careful not to make my black super, super dark right out of the gate. You wanna have some space on either side of your value scale. You don't, even though this is like stark white, I would be very hesitant to go in here with a bright white because I wanna have the space to keep pushing the white if I need to. It just like, it's like having an extra option towards the end when you're kind of refining things. Being able to make something darker or lighter at the end of your painting is really helpful. So I just compress the values a little bit. You know, if you're familiar with photo editing, making sure your contrast isn't too high right out of the gate. In fact, if you paint from reference photos specifically, and you find that you're really struggling with making your work too contrasty, it's like you don't feel like you're very in control of your values, try editing a version of your photo. So save a duplicate and turn the contrast down lower than you think, and try working from that in the beginning and then later work from your other photo. I've had to do that before. Also gonna recommend a value study, but those are always helpful. Anyways, so I'm just gonna start working in here and getting these knocked in. So the next thing I'm gonna do is mix a brown. One thing I try to do in my paintings, I think kind of out of laziness, to be honest with you, but also I think it might be helpful, is I will try to mix one pile of paint for as long as possible. This helps the saturation from being too bright, just so it's not like, one thing about acrylic paint is that it can look flat, and I think part of that is because unlike oils where it stays wet and you sort of naturally by mixing develop more neutrals or colors that tend to pull a little more neutral, acrylic dries instantly. So I could have the muddiest and gnarliest mess on here of just like pure neutrals, but if it dries for 5, 10, 20 minutes and I go in with a screaming neon color, I put it on top, assuming it's not super transparent, all of a sudden the brightest, most artificial color is right at the front of the canvas. And so it's that ability to have that very fakey, plasticky color kind of out of nowhere that makes, I think, acrylic come off as kind of tacky and hard to control as far as color and flat. But there's ways to mitigate that, right? I always get a little minorly offended when people are like, oh, acrylic paint is flat. Yeah, if you're used to doing oil and you try to paint in acrylic, it's gonna, if you try to that same approach, it's gonna look very flat. But the way I mitigate that is I will mix kind of a muddy pile for a long time. People ask if I use medium. I don't usually too often, but sometimes I will add a tiny bit of water to my brush. So I'll just dab it in there and use that sometimes. So a lot of the composition is brown. You know, even something like the gold of this lipstick, we see it as gold because we see the specular highlights, aka the mirror-like quality to the, you know, the gold part of the lipstick. And to us it reads gold. And we see this amber ashtray. Amber is like another hue name for brown, like an orangey brown. It's translucent in this case. And all of these words definitely elicit different pictures for us. But strictly going off of like a color mixing standpoint, they're both brown and they're almost the same color, but we see it as gold because we see that browny, greeny brown color, but in two more yellowy colors on the side. And we read that as like shiny and brown, yellow, and that makes us think gold. So color is a very interesting sort of thing, but you know, instead of being like, oh, gold is this big separate entity, really try to be objective and say, is the same color I mixed for this eligible for this? And then I think it is. You know, the thing about being good at painting, and the reason why I think more people should paint, even if you're the worst painter, you're like, you're not good at it. I think the practice of looking objectively at things that you've always sort of just looked at is really, really helpful. because it sort of pushes you to see the world as it is and not how you know it. There's this big phrase in painting, it's paint what you see, not what you know. And I find that that can confuse students, but like that's the essence of what's so fun about painting, is like you're painting, you know, you're having to force yourself to be objective when you've been able to exist visually in the world very subjectively. And you don't think it's subjective until you start painting. You know, another analogy I really like is that one time someone said that seeing and like observing is to looking as listening is to hearing. And to break that down just a little further for a second, you know, the idea is that, you know, you can hear people talking, you know, background noise, another conversation. And, you know, you can check your phone and sort of tune it out because you're not listening. Listening means that your attention is towards whatever this is. And you can kind of retell what happened and you took it in. You took it into a deeper, more high functioning part of your mind. And same thing with seeing, and people don't often know that until they've really had to be attentive to the visual world around them. But you know, you can look and sort of like, okay, I'm looking at a room, and it helps you to orient where you are in space and all that. But you haven't really noticed and perceived and really picked up on things until you've really forced yourself to observe. And it's as big as a gap between hearing and listening. And I think that that's something that tends to shock people, is they're like, well, I use my eyes all the time, I can just look at it. But it really is like a different muscle. You're sort of training yourself to observe in a different way. And so I say that not to be like, look at artists, like we can do this special kind of looking. No, not at all. But if you're new to this, if you're very new, I just want to remind you that even just the act of sort of learning how to look might be fatiguing. It might be tiring. It might make you want to give up because you're like, well, I'm just using my eyeballs. Like, what's the challenge? But if you've never had to observe in a way like you do when you're painting something, give yourself tremendous grace. Be nice to yourself. So I'm going to go ahead and do a lot of these pinks and reds now. And I'm using the same dirty brush. So despite grabbing a very bright color, this magenta, it's gonna be muted, and I'm okay with that. I want the space later to bring up the color if I need to. While I have this red, I can mix some white into it and give myself that nice, pretty pale pink of my body spray. So, you know, part of how I navigate my painting and how I know what to go to is, and I think this is from years of like being super duper on a budget, is I will just be like, where else can I use this paint so I don't have to waste it? Which, you know, can seem stingy, but I think it's been helpful overall. But, you know, I have this color, and then I can mix a little more white and blue and get this color. You know, being resourceful has its perks, I will say. And as it goes into shadow, it reads cooler than the part that is in the sunlight. It's a minor change and, you know, not the most obvious one, but I do notice it. Okay, and then I have one more place I can use kind of a pink color before I think I have to move on to a different hue, and that is the Great Lash, which is here. Okay, before I move on though, I'm gonna do, since this is nice and warm, I'm gonna take yellow and see what I have left over here in my brown, and I realize I wanna fill this in. But it's very yellow. It almost feels like the back part of it is greenish. I think it probably feels green by contrast because of how warm the edges are, but I'm gonna go ahead and put that in. Now I need to do some cool colors. I wipe excess paint. I'm gonna keep with this brush for as long as I can. but I'm gonna wipe some of the excess paint off on here. I try to get as little paint into the water as possible. Obviously you do get paint into your paint water, but I find that wiping off excess means that like now I don't even have to use my water. I can just go ahead and mix in my cool colors that I'm gonna use. I couldn't use this with the cool colors because it had too much warm in it, but now I can since I wiped it off. And you know, I will explain in other videos how I clean up my paint water mess because it's important to not put acrylic paint water into the water supply. It is microplastics and it's pretty bad for the environment and health, and you know, not advised. But one of the things I do in my process is I try to mitigate how much I use. So that's one of the ways. So if you ever see me do that, I probably won't draw much attention to it from here on out, but that's what I'm doing. Okay. And another thing to remember is that the objects in the front of the composition, so here, foreground, midground, background, it's not the most depth, you know, but there is still that hierarchy. But the objects in the foreground are always gonna be your most saturated colors. And so that's just something you can keep in mind. You can sort of exaggerate that perspective. Because if you think of like a big, long landscape, right? You're looking at the edge of a mountain, you're standing on a summit. You're gonna see in the background, like these purpley gray mountains in the background. And then everything up close is gonna be increasingly levels of green. And that is because of atmospheric perspective. That's because when things are far away, they're not as saturated. And so we can, to the best of our ability, mimic that in a painting to create that forced perspective. And so I can, again, dedicate more content to that in the future. But it's, you know, if you're wondering why I'm exaggerating things, that's why. Silver, a lot like the gold conversation, is just shiny, shiny, shiny gray. Various forms of gray. And gray is like, it can be just a mixture of black and white, but I find it's any really neutral, cool color. So something can be called gray when really it's just low intensity blue, which is what this is. And then if you just make it look shiny, then you know, you have something that's gray effectively. So now the other thing I have left before I get to the white background is the shadows. And make sure you don't all paint all your shadows the same color. It's important to really observe the color of the shadows because they often reflect back the color of the object. You know, there's physics going on, that's just how that works. And so, you know, these cherry shadows, the shadows are very close to the cherry physically. It's not some big, long, extended shadow. And because of that, they reflect a lot of the red in the cherry back. Believe it or not, a pretty good first step for me. And I mean, I wasn't kidding when I said the 75% rule. I'm not just like being a smug artist who can like nail it on the first go and is saying 75% to be like relatable. Truly, like 75%. Like if I squint my eyes, I'm like, yeah, I know what I'm looking at, but when you get up close, it's a mess. I like that effect. You know, I'm a sucker for going up to a singer sergeant and having that, like, it looks hyper realistic from across the room and then up close it's all smudgy. I love that, but even in the first go, I'm just getting it down. Speed is important. You know, there's kind of this thought where like, if you're not working over something and belaboring over it painstakingly, that like it's maybe lesser of value if you can kind of whip it out. But I will say, getting yourself out of your like super analytical part of your brain, and getting yourself into sort of just like gut instinct mode. Maybe if you're brand new to painting, this is not applicable, but if you've painted for any length of time, and I even mean just like a few months diligently, you know more than you think. But the analytical part of your brain that's doing all the juggling of like, okay, what color, what value, where does it go, where does the highlight go, all of those things that we juggle when we're painting representationally, we can sort of talk ourselves in and out of good choices, where I find that if you sort of just go at it quickly and just lay it in there, and is it messy? Yeah. Did I mess up? Yeah. But you very quickly get enough of a framework that then you can reintroduce those more analytical thoughts object by object as you work through your painting. But having it sort of just be able to get pushed out like this is really helpful. And one thing I'll even say at this first step, one thing I'll even sort of mention at this first step is sometimes I don't even consider my painting a painting until after this step. The initial block-in is really like vibes only, so to speak. It's really just like, get what you see on there, have an impression of it, get it on there quickly. I labor over the drawing a little. I'm checking, I'm double checking, I'm checking. The less familiar I am with the objects, I check more. But this step, it's really as much as just like blocking it in as possible. And what I'll do next is I'll have a drawing, the redraw, and then I'll keep kind of chiseling and refining. Another analogy I'll leave you with before I jump into the next part is I like to think of a microscope, and how you have like 3 different dials on a microscope. You have like the big one where you're just kind of looking for the object. This is this step. It's just, I'm finding this. Like, I'm not painting, I'm just finding. And then the medium dial sort of starts to zoom you in. That's the next step, few steps depending on your painting process. And then like whenever I'm writing all the little details and putting the highlights on, and that is the fine tuning. And you can't mix up those orders. You can't start fine tuning when you still haven't found the object yet. And so that's kind of how I like to think of this painting process. I love it because I love it, and I guess I'm biased to it. It's obviously how I paint. But I love it as a teacher too, because I feel like having that order helps students. Like, you're not gonna be crystal clear of what you're looking at in the details when you're still finding it. And, you don't have to get so bogged down by making sure the Dr. Pepper is written out correctly if you're still in the middle tuning phase and you're just getting your values and colors in the right spot. And for that reason, I love it. And hopefully that analogy helped you guys.
5 minutes later.
So while I'm doing the redraw, I'm gonna go ahead and talk to you guys about my book that's coming out. I'm really excited about it. So I've always wanted to do a book cover. I've had some things that have been on my professional dream list, vision board, if you will, for a pretty long time. One of them is doing a book cover, which is something I started doing a 1.5 years ago-ish. And I remember during the whole process being like, oh, I would love to write a book. Now, granted, writing is a strong word. I did write for this book, but it's a, it's a how-to still life, step-by-step book. The idea is, I started really teaching online because of my step-by-step carousel posts on Instagram, where I would break down every step. So I'd have the drawing, this step, etc., etc. And when this company reached out to me, this publisher, to do a book, it just seemed like a really good fit. I love doing step-by-steps. And so we started working on it. I will make more videos in the future if y'all want about like exactly what the process looked like, because it's interesting. There's an advance, you get an advance on it, you have an editor, all that stuff. I had a really lovely team, and it was a really fun process. It's nice to have your thoughts kind of out in written words, kind of all in one place. And so I really enjoyed the whole process. I talk about painting, I talk about, there's some kind of Sari philosophy in there. And yeah, I'm really proud of it. Hopefully you guys will get a hold of it soon and check it out. But yeah, it's one of those dream projects that you work on and you're just kind of like, pinch me. But yeah, I hope to do more in the future. Art books, other kinds of books. I may already be working on different books, but we'll see if they happen. But anyways, if you want to learn more about my technique, and videos are a little harder for you to utilize and you'd rather see a book, which for a lot of things, that's kind of how I am. I like to be able to stare at one image for a long time and kind of flip back and forth. Some of my best painting resources outside of my, obviously my schooling, were books. If you guys want me to make, I would love to make a video. I'll probably do it anyways, actually. But I want to do a video of my favorite art books, because I think they've been a huge help in my life, and I love a good book. I love supporting publishers, authors, all that good stuff. So I'm really proud of this. So this is a pretty good redraw. Remember, it's just refining more and more and more. So, we're just getting closer. We're kind of in that middle fine-tuning phase. So this meets the qualifications. The only thing I had egregiously wrong as far as proportions was this juncture right here. All of my cherries feel like they were a little big. And, everything else was just slight tweaking. I have a couple of ellipses in here, and those are always tricky. I won't say hard. They just, take a little finesse. But, pretty good for a redraw. Again, the goal is not to perfectly render this. I'm not drawing like with a graphite pencil. I'm just refining and moving things up as I go. All right, now we're going at it again. So the last time I filled in my composition, I used a pretty large brush, and that did two things for me. One, it helped me cover the ground quickly, and it also kept me from being able to paint detail. So it's a trade-off. But now I'm gonna select a smaller brush and begin to refine a little bit. I'm gonna go ahead and go with one of my trusties. I really like these brushes. These are the Artist Loft Firenze. It's probably Italian. I remind you guys, I'm from the Ozarks, so it's honestly a miracle that I can speak English, at least for me personally. But I really like these. I think they're Michael's brushes, and I do really like these. They're pretty firm, they hold their shape, and they're pretty sturdy. So I'm gonna use this and go in, and I'm gonna once again start at my darkest values. Again, I'm not making them as dark as they are on my reference photo. I'm gonna restrain myself and work my way around that way. I'm starting out with my darkest value, and much like last time, it's a lot of these dark reds. There is black in here, and I will say I do have black on my palette. There's nothing wrong with having black on your palette per se. I do think as a student, it's better to know how to get to chromatic blacks, which just means mixing black out of your palette on your own. I usually do it like that, but I was doing a big disco ball and it had a lot of black, so I thought I would use it. Because if you're doing a nocturne, it may not make sense to mix your own black, because it's, a lot of your time and energy will be spent mixing whatever combo of black you use. If it's like alizarin crimson and phthalo blue, or, hooker's green or something, then that's great. It's good to know that. If you already know you're going to use a lot of it, then it's fine to have it on there. There's nothing wrong. Sometimes a lot of the rules, the art rules, are actually just rules that kind of lend themselves towards art education. So to build up the ability to mix your own way down the value scale, make things darker using color. I would probably, if I taught a semester, encourage my painting 1 students to not use black. See myself doing that. But sometimes it mutates from a good rule when you're starting out painting is don't have black on your palette, and it morphs into this weird rule that has kind of, in my opinion, overstayed its welcome. And you'll see people on TikTok be like, you're not supposed to have black on your palette. It's like, I don't know, man, I think this person is fine. So just know, for every art rule, there's an exception. Art is literally about exceptions. but B, a lot of the times the rules that feel so steadfast are just like vestiges from art school and can easily be ignored. Another way we can create depth is making whatever's in the background smaller if the object is a controlled object size. So for example, these cherries are all, we can sort of assume, roughly the same size, but the ones in the background, this part, are smaller than the ones in the foreground, and that helps the viewer see depth. Okay, so the next place that I see dark colors that I want to maybe talk through is the pattern on this purse. So patterns can be a little challenging if you're newer to painting, because we're having to translate a two-dimensional surface pattern into a three-dimensional surface, of an object back into a two-dimensional. It can just get a little, it can just mentally get tricky. I've certainly myself been tripped up on it, but I've also seen other students, struggle. So there's this idea that you don't want to render something that's a pattern, or, even like if you have like a book cover in your composition and it has like a person's face on it, you don't want it to actually look like a person's face is in front of you. And, unless you're painting in like hyper realism, and even then it can be tricky. It's easy for that to take form, like look like actual little crowns on here, when you don't want it to do that. So my trick, or like the way I kind of approach it, is I will make it a little flatter than the rest of the painting. This can happen in a couple of ways. One, I can resolve it with everything else and just not resolve it, to such clarity as the painting evolves. But I find that what kind of tends to happen more than not is, I will just kind of leave it at this stage. So you'll see like it's starting to refine, but this stage is still very rough. But sometimes what can happen is I'll kind of block it in and it ends up being like this is adequate. It kind of says, hey, this is a pattern, without being so specific that everyone can tell what's going on. So a lot of this will make sense when I do the lighter brown in just a second. And as far as like what colors I'm mixing, truly, I'm just kind of trying to mix to the best of my ability what I see and like play with local color. But obviously, I've demoed enough in person. I'm lucky enough to get to do these really fun international retreats about once a year. And when I demo, one thing gets asked a lot is some people particularly will get really, curious, like what colors are you using? What are you mixing? And I'll explain why I don't completely narrate my color thing. Hopefully you're getting a palette shot, fingers crossed. And if you are, you'll see it's kind of like I said earlier, I'm just mixing a lot of color into whatever pile I picked. So it's a lot of just like getting this to a more amber color and kind of just learning how to do that. But the reason I don't go into too much detail and do what's often called as giving like color recipes is because I'm wanting my students to develop their own perception of color. And by that I mean like it's more important that instead of exactly mixing the same ratios of colors that I'm mixing, like a color recipe, that you just know that this is warmer, cooler, brighter, less saturated, more saturated, and sort of learn to navigate color in that way. And a lot of where I go when I'm color mixing, like what colors do I choose, whatever's on my brush kind of guides me. So I have green on here now, so I'm just taking care of everything green. And sometimes things need pretty close to an overhaul, and other times they don't. Right now I'm trying to mix this color, the background color of this purse. And as far as what do, it's usually, okay, it's brown, but it's cooler and it's lighter. And so you start with brown, and to make brown cool, since brown is like an orangey red typically, you get its complement, so green and blue. And you kind of go back and forth. I often think of it like if you can visualize like a putting green in your head, and the color I want is the hole in the ground. And I'm trying to mix my color. Obviously, ideally, you mix it right away. You just sort of make a combo and bam, you have the color. It never works like that. Almost never. And so what I do is I just, I overshoot. I made it too light, and then I make it darker, and then I made it too green, and then I make it, you just kind of, until eventually you get close enough. And I will say, you always have to test, because the color you have on your palette, like to me, this feels so light and so green, but I put it on here and I'm surprised it's not too green, but it's not light enough. And so you just don't know until you kind of mix it. And that's how you learn. So every time I kind of do something, I worked on the ashtray, I worked on the purse, kind of, I will take a beat and ask myself, is there a part of this that's either running away? By that I mean like I'm resolving this all of a sudden to perfect resolve. It's like, looks really realistic at this point. Or is there something I'm leaving kind of in the back? And I would say yes. Now it may look like the cigarette box isn't too much behind the rest of the painting, there's stuff. But another aspect of, creating depth is not only having the most saturated things in the front and the biggest things in the front if the size is the same. But also, in order to create that depth, you want to have the things in the foreground and the front be the most rendered. It's gonna read as having the most clarity. Obviously, you're the artist, so you're gonna know I worked the hardest, spent the most time on the things in the foreground, an intermediate time in the midground, and less in the background. But the viewer, it is important to always sort of be aware that you're the artist, but keep in mind the viewer. Because, I assume you're not making art in a vacuum. Maybe you are, maybe you are. But if you're anticipating viewers, the viewer is gonna read it as clarity. The thing in the foreground is the clearest to me. And then the midground, it's a middle level of clear, and etc. And this mimics real life, human vision. If you are looking at this big, long, expansive space, the things in the foreground are going to be the clearest, and everything, etc. Right? Going back until you get to the mountains in the background. And while you can see them, and it's impressive that humans can see so far, you're not gonna see the trees. You're gonna see bluish green mountains. And obviously, we don't have so much depth here that actually happens, but it is a visual cue for the audience, the viewer, that I am looking at something with depth if the things in the foreground are the clearest, if it follows that logic, right? As a painter, we have to have the know-how to sort of divorce ourselves from our own perception so that we can see what we're looking at. But we have to bear in mind that our audience probably won't be looking at this as an artist. They'll be looking at it as a layperson, you know? And because of that, you can play into the fact that they're going to be using their perception skills and their history of perception, visual perception, to inform how they're taking in a painting. So you could talk about that ad nauseum. I'm sure I'll bring it up over and over again. If you are confused, stay tuned. I talk about it all the time. But all that to say, that long ramble was meant to inform y'all that this needs to be rendered a lot more because it's falling behind and it's in a position where I need this to be clearer. If you're enjoying this video, make sure to hit subscribe. You can also click on the bell notification to be the first to be notified whenever I upload a new demo, tutorial, or just an art talk. So whenever you're making a graphic on something, it can look and feel like you're blending or that you're doing something really intricate. But in reality, you're kind of just doing the same thing you're doing with everything else. You're just sort of, you know, mixing and putting down blobs. And when you're up close to it, you can see what I mean. I will say, like, it's the kind of as close to like magic part of painting as you can get, where you're really doing the same thing of laying down blocks and colors. But when you size down your brush, it starts to feel like, not an optical illusion obviously, but you know, that it looks like it's detailed and gradient, but it's not. And so I didn't want to just time lapse this part without kind of filling you in, because it looks like a lot is happening, and you know, maybe a lot is happening, but in reality I'm just sort of making the same choices I have throughout the whole composition. I'm just sort of keying into one subject, in this case these cigarettes. And you know, again, I'm kind of biting by my 75% rule, although I will say what tends to happen is that as the painting goes on, that 75 turns into an 80, turns into an 85. So here I'm probably working closer to an 85, you know, as far as like getting it resolved more so. But yeah, that's kind of where I'm at. I'm just sort of putting blobs in and making it work. It's a lot of paying attention to the subtle color changes. Like this misty cigarette box is white, don't get me wrong, but it's like more gray around the corners, and as you move into the box a little bit, you lose some of that gray and it kind of turns back into a white. So it's just little color shifts and details. I will say that's the thing that, like, it's hard to teach. It's more like you eventually sort of learn how to look for things. It's just about fine tuning and finding some of those details. So that's kind of what I'm doing here. It may look kind of, I'm sure in time-lapse mode it looks really magical, but I promise you, every little decision is the same thing I'm doing everywhere else, just smaller, and the choices being smaller does something to it. I don't know what it does, but it does something. Okay, so we can see a little bit more refining step by step. You know, the thing about the book that's coming out that's nice as opposed to videos is you have that nice still where you can kind of flip between pages and see what went down. You know, even when I do in-person demos, which, you know, I'm always so impressed when people enjoy those because you're literally watching paint dry. But whenever you see it in person, you know, it kind of like, you know, it's almost like watching a sculpture. Like it's little bit by little bit kind of gets, the ambiguity slowly gets chipped away at, and then eventually like a painting kind of emerges. And so being able to flip back and forth between a page and like discernibly like knowing like which parts were worked on can be really helpful, especially because a lot of painters, myself, I guess I could say me, hops around a little bit. I think some painters take a more straightforward approach. They'll either work through by color or by value. Those things guide me, but I will say this is where my ADHD is my superpower, because I will just hop around to wherever kind of bothers me the most. But we can see here, like, little things are starting to get refined. Maybe this is a Dr. Pepper can as opposed to a Coke can, you know, chipping away the ambiguity. Like, there's just a little more information. I can't read this, but I know that it doesn't look like a C. So some of the ambiguity about what this is going away. You know, this could have been a wooden bowl earlier. It was brown. And now there's some translucency here, and maybe it's amber, and, you know, just things like that. The cigarettes, like, it was kind of this ambiguous maybe book thing in the front, and now, and maybe if you aren't familiar with cigarettes, you don't know. For me, I can clock that anywhere, those little misty cigarettes. But you're starting to see more and more of it fully come together. I'm gonna go ahead and do another round of carving out with the background color. Another concept that I think is really important to painting and my approach is carving something out. Okay, what does that mean? I keep saying carving. Obviously I'm not carving. But metaphorically, what that means is whenever you paint something, let's say, you know, I put this edge in, and you can see where the redraw line is. This is not, you know, I painted it too large, and so I'll have to take this background and carve out the shape. I find that that does two things. One, I think it's a more accurate way of drawing. You know, we're not using a little pencil to draw perfectly and then filling it in. We're not filling in, we're not coloring as painters. But also, when something is like a pattern, or like, I do this a lot with leaves if I'm painting a tree or a bush or something floral, but that back and forth creates that more dimensional look, where instead of it looking like it's colored in, it has more of that like lifelike kind of vibe to it. You know, it's always hard to know exactly what you mean until you see it, but I'll go back in with this white and clean it up, and hopefully it'll make more sense. So we can see how much adding the white back in helped in certain areas. You know, at this point I sort of take a pause and I ask myself where else could be refined. And for me, this section, this little tangent, feels like it needs work. And that's kind of the game of painting, right? It can feel like a game of whack-a-mole. You're just you're getting one thing and then the other. And it's not that things are popping back up per se. It's really, you know, it's more that something will get resolved a little more, and then all of a sudden that Dr. Pepper can that looked pretty good, you know, a few minutes ago, all of a sudden starts to feel like it's lagging behind. And that's just the process. You know, another thing I'll point out here at this stage is that I'm letting there be lots of juicy brushstrokes. I love a painting that feels like a painting.
You know, my favorite thing about the movie is like it feels like a movie.
To quote Harry Styles. I like when the painting isn't trying to be a photo. You know, I was born in the 90s. I'm used to, like, I grew up, like, photos have looked hyper realistic since I've been around. They've been, you know, photos have been so present my whole life. Most people who are alive right now. It's not special, but, you know, and I've been around with the internet my whole life, and I'm aware, like, something looking really realistic is not shiny or exciting to me, as it may have been 200, 300, 500 years ago. And so that affords me the sort of space as a painter to be like, I'm painting realism. Like, that's kind of my wheelhouse right now. That's the game I'm playing. But if things are globby, gloopy, like, all the better. Like, if I can maintain some of this brush stroke in this can at the end, like, great. Does it look a little less like a finished can? Yeah, sure, totally. But for me, it's that balance of like gloopy, globby paint, and then like somehow it kind of looks realistic. That's my favorite place to be in. You know, I know a lot of painters who enjoy that. Maybe you do, maybe you don't. It's all up to you. But that's where I like to play. And so at this stage, like, you'll notice like I'm getting a little aggressive and haphazard in certain areas. I love that. I'm good with that. You know, at some point it kind of undoes it for me, and everyone has a different threshold for that. But right now, like, I'm throwing paint on a canvas, and then I take a break and I figure out what needs to be resolved. That's the game I'm playing. And I will say, as the painting goes on, I will find myself picking smaller and smaller and smaller brushes as it progresses. And that's totally normal. So the idea is that, again, you're just chipping away little by little until you get to a point where it's starting to sort of come together. You know, and I laugh when I say come together because it doesn't always feel like it in the moment. You know, painting is, I think sometimes gets a bad rep that it's like you sort of relax and you have a glass of wine. And I guess it can be, you know, some kinds of painting are more intuitive. I could see that, but you know, a lot of this process of painting representationally, it feels more like a complicated puzzle or Rubik's Cube. And you know, if you work hard enough, you can get to the point where it is like very absorbing and very enjoyable in that capacity. But rarely is it just like joyful and pleasurable in the same way that like watching Netflix is. It's not passive. And so there's a sensation of like frustration that frustration is not even the right word, but just like difficulty that can come up. And I just want to remind you guys that that is part of the process. And usually what ends up happening is I'll get to this point. Rarely do I make a painting all in one go. That's just not how I typically paint anymore. But I'm looking forward to coming at this with fresh eyes. I painted long enough to know that this is a good stopping point. I'm going to come back in with fresh eyes, and I'm excited to see where I can push this.
24 hours later.
Welcome back to the studio. It's the next day. I've rested. I have what I consider fresh eyes. And you know, the power of having a new set of eyes, obviously metaphorically, but you know, once you've looked at something for so long, you know, your ability to sort of fine tune starts to deteriorate. And I find that the trickiest spot to be in is when you resolve a painting to this point, but it's at the end of your working day. And whether you can do an hour at a time, 2 hours, 4 hours, whatever, we're all different. But when you get to the end of your natural ability to focus, at least the kind of focus that painting requires, you know, it's sort of perfectly imperfect that by the time you get to this point, your ability to make those choices kind of deteriorates, or at least it does, certainly for me. I've seen it in my students, but I suppose I can only really speak for myself. That's why I love going to bed, waking up the next day, coming out to my studio. And not only will it reveal things to me of like, oh, well, the reason why this wasn't working is because of some obvious error that now is obvious, where last night it wasn't. And also, you know, even if that doesn't happen quite so dramatically, you do just have, you know, a better sense of your painting and more energy. And painting requires a lot of energy, you know, especially painting representationally. So I definitely don't take it for granted, but I have my tea, I'm ready to go. We're gonna jump right in. And I try not to make too many, like, I try not to forecast too much, because like, I think I probably have another hour or so on it. I would say this is resolved to about 70%, 75, our magic number here, percent completion. But you never know. Sometimes you get in the weeds, you think you're almost done, and then all of this needs an overhaul. So again, I'm knock on wood, but I think that's about where I'm at. So let's just jump into it. So the next thing that I'm feeling compelled to do is maybe a slight redraw. That's always my instinct when I hop back into a painting, is kind of taking advantage of, again, fresh eyes, you know, the newer feeling of looking at your painting with a different perspective, to go in and fix some of the major drawing errors. You know, and when I look into this, I don't see as many drawing errors as it kind of feels like when you look at it at first. So I'm trying to work my way through that. I think what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna start with these small objects, and then I'll reevaluate. I know that the big thing for me, other than resolving the composition a little more, is I want this and this white to play off each other better. I don't know exactly what that means, but if I'm making a wish list for where I want this painting to go, because remember, like, we're not, even as much experience as I have over the years of painting, we're never as in control as we think we are. So I find language about, like, you know, I will fix, I will make perfect, you know, that language, maybe I use it, but I try not to. In more, I give myself questions and problems, like kind of like math problems, or just, you know, but it's painting. You know, I want to see if I can resolve this. Resolve might not mean perfectly rendered exactly how I want, but I can get it to a place where I'm like, you know what, truce. You know, I also give myself questions of like, what will the painting look like if I get all these small objects rendered? Will it still need a redraw? I'm curious about that. So, you know, just giving myself goals, hopes, intentions, rather than like promises of fixing things. I think that that can make the somewhat daunting task of painting representationally feel a little bit more approachable, I find. I'm trying to resist the urge to zoom in too much. I think this object to me feels the most, this little green color corrector feels the most off. So I'll just start by working at that. So painting in this object is really just a matter of like paying attention to kind of the details and what's around it. You know, something that seemingly maybe doesn't make sense is that there's this little yellowish line right here. And on its own, it can seem maybe a bit out of place, but when we realize that it's reflecting this off of it, all of a sudden it makes a little more sense. And so again, it's getting back to kind of what I think was the mission statement maybe of this painting, which is that you paint what you see and not what you know. And I find that the act of painting, especially a still life, because things are so controlled and, you know, we don't have for most of us, don't have like a working memory of like what this little tube looks like, at least not in the level of accuracy it would take to render it. And so because of that, we really are pretty beholden to what we're looking at. And so we can trust these forms. And, you know, I feel like if you can pay attention that things are just lines and dashes and blobs and squares, all of a sudden this becomes realized. And, you know, up close, not hyper realistic, I would say, but by sort of staying tethered to that exercise of painting what you see and not what you know, you do end up walking away with something where you tilt back, you're like, oh yeah, it does look like it. And I think it's that activity that I find to be the most addictive about painting, is it's this little bit of like, you're almost playing like a magic trick, or you're like delighting yourself. And so even with something like this, you know, it looks so chunky and blobby, but then you lean back and it functions. And I think that that's, you know, kind of what you're doing. And so the reason I bring this up is because when you're in the thick of it, when you're in the weeds, it is normal to feel like maybe you're not doing it, like it's not coming together. And then you take a step back, whether it's a lean back, or if I was in my own private studio not filming, it would be a few paces backwards. It would make sense. And it's that kind of back and forth that we're trying to do. And in one way it's hard because you're sort of having to push back the need to fix and resolve and polish and make look like a thing up close, for the ability to step back and have it make sense and whole. So anyways, I just bring that up because sometimes whenever I'm doing these, I don't talk through exactly what I'm doing, but it's really place this line here, does it work? Place that line there, does it work? Sometimes the answer is yes. I find the more I paint, the more the answer tends to be yes over the years. But in the beginning, it was normal for, you know, 3 out of every 5 marks to be wrong and just have to go back and keep tweaking. I had a student one time say that it the way I described it and the way they understood painting is it kind of felt like a Sudoku puzzle. And yes, that's exactly right. I would say that that is kind of what it should feel like. Okay, one thing I'm gonna do is I'm gonna carve out the background a little bit. One thing that's bothering me is that this feels convex. Is that right? Concave? It bends in. I think that's concave. Anyways, and so I want to resolve that real quick. And yes, I use straight edges all the time. I can draw a pretty straight line, but it's like I tell my students all the time, like no one's in the rafters waiting to give you a medal for like not using any helpful tools. If it helps you realize your vision, then by all means use it. And so with things like this, I find that to be really helpful. So that worked enough. I may have to revisit some dimensions, but if making a straight line, because I can tell this is a straight line, messes up whatever you were working on, likely you weren't as resolved as you thought you were. So it's just, you know, you have to let the truth lead the way, even if it kind of blows up everything around it. Good metaphor for life as well. But yeah, so while I have this and this like background color kind of mixed up, I'm actually gonna do that in a couple places. This actually needs more of a build out on that side, but let me, yeah, I was about to say, I think the mascara is more of a victim of not building it out enough, but that's fine, that's fine. Same with, whenever you're painting something, never sleep on the power of mixing something just like a half shade lighter to create depth. You know, if you're noticing that there's a shift in color, make sure you notice how big of a change in value it is, or like how subtle of a change it is in this case. You know, just adding a little bit of this depth in here, I think really changes the way it looks and adds, you know, a dimension to it. It doesn't look so flat, but it's not a huge step up. And so, you know, paying attention to those little subtleties, I think really elevates your work. It's also important to make sure that you pay attention to the reflected light that's getting reflected back onto the object. And remember with text, just because you have the capability to make your hand into kind of a pencil position doesn't mean everything warrants that. You know, I find that when you paint text, you really can just, you know, you'd be amazed what a good attentive swiggle will do. And it's important to make sure that you capture all that lovely reflected light, because that's what makes it look like a painting that's all collective and cohesive, as opposed to a bunch of various illustrations of objects. And I know it's like it can be a little bit of a elusive thing to really get a hold of. You know, how do you make something look cohesive? And there's a lot of things that tie into that, composition, color, etc. But I find that until you kind of get a sense of what that feels like, one thing you can do right out of the gate is make sure you pay attention when the objects, especially things that are translucent or reflective, pull in other objects around them. And you can also ask yourself the question, like, how important is it to me that this is brand recognizable? You know, for me, it is pretty important. But you know, one thing I'll say is that you don't have to necessarily have the name off of everything for it to be understandable. I always think of the example of like this Great Lash or like a chapstick brand chapstick, and you know, they have put a lot of marketing money behind making sure that this particular combo of pink and green plastic in a tube makes you think Great Lash. And so you don't have to reinvent the wheel. You don't have to actually write out Great Lash, or in this case Dr. Pepper, necessarily. You know, and you want to still stick to painting what you see kind of representationally to the best of your ability, but you can sort of use the iconic Dr. Pepper red and you know, various other things to illustrate, literally, what it is the audience is looking at. But never underestimate the audience's ability to fill in the gaps. You know, people are really good at seeing things where there aren't things. You know, I post a bunch of disco ball paintings, and to the best of my ability, the tile placement is random. You know, I used to use reference photos. Sometimes I'll pull a reference photo, but at this point, nearly 5 years into painting them, you know, I just make up tiles. And so one thing that happens kind of a lot is I'll paint one and someone will say, oh, I see Yoshi, or oh, I see a bow tie, or, you know, whatever. And never underestimate people's ability to want to see what they're looking at. Even abstract artists will have to kind of contend with that. It's like you're painting clouds. Well, someone is going to see like a baby or a bird or, you know, a dog in the clouds. So don't forget that there's power in hinting and insinuating, and don't feel like you can't explain what's happening unless you perfectly spell it out. In fact, last thing I'll say about this, people like to fill in the gap. It is a pleasurable experience to hint at something and then someone kind of pick up on it. You know, my favorite artists are the kinds of artists who don't spoon feed the viewer, who really let things be a little more ambiguous and really play to that. And this is another example of that back and forth that I mentioned, where with lettering, I do this a lot, where I'll sort of write in the letters, use the background to carve it out, write back in the letters where it needs it, carve out, back and forth. And you know, the hope is that eventually you find sort of a homeostasis, you know, from carving out and then writing in and carving out and writing in. You know, if you want to practice that carving out, actually writing, taking a picture or photo or reference of something that does have writing on it, so, you know, can of Dr. Pepper, whatever it is, and play around with writing the text. Don't get into pencil mode, tempting as it is. Try to the best of your ability to just carve in and out using text. It's a really good, like, low stakes way of trying that approach out. Plus, I'm sure you know someone, a family member, who like loves Pepsi or Diet Coke or Dr. Pepper, and you can give them a can of Dr. Pepper painting and you can practice all at once. So the thing is, I don't want to resolve anything too much. I do find myself kind of going from object to object, which can happen at the end of the painting. I would highly advise against completely fixing, resolving, solving something early on in your process. I kind of save it for the end. But you know, if you do find yourself kind of getting to this point and kind of going object by object, that's fine. I usually kind of resist the urge to fully polish things. I found that more recently I've let myself, I feel like I've earned, so to speak, the ability to like let something run away from the rest. The risk of doing that, of like not pumping the brakes and getting it most of the way resolved and then kind of pausing, is you can resolve something so far that then you have to resolve everything to the same level. And then also you could be, if you do it too early, you might have made this perfect little Dr. Pepper can only to find out that your drawing was all off and your whole painting kind of doesn't make sense unless you move it. And you know, obviously there's nothing terribly wrong with that. Practice is practice, right? But if it's gonna be like, if it's gonna be devastating to have to do that and you're not gonna wanna move things, try to keep things loose until later. You know, and my goal is, when I'm resolving things, is to not make it look so polished. I don't like that look. So I'm trying to the best of my ability to get things close. You know, another kind of reason for that I can actually show right here with this example is, you know, the transparency rather of this lid on here doesn't really function until I fully pin down the color of the background. I think it's close, but you know, putting in this color, if I change the background, and I've done this quite a bit actually, like it won't work unless I have the background color kind of figured out. So that's like another reason you would want to wait to do like the last bits of highlights, because your highlights are going to be responding to the lightest values, and if you've put off doing the lightest values, you see where that could be a little tricky. So just, you know, pump the brakes, try not to resolve anything fully to completion until, I don't know, until you're like, most of your painting is mostly resolved. I have to ask myself what needs to be resolved. The cherries are weirdly enough kind of bothering me. And the purses. So I think that's where I'm gonna play around at. I'm really loving this brush right now. I keep finding myself reuse it over and over again. Sometimes I love something that's really straight and stiff, but this brush is nice and soft. It's one of, let's see, Cheap Joe's art stuff. One of their white nylon brushes, and I'm really digging it. So I'm just gonna go with it. I'm always so shocked at how much just a slight tweak can really help a painting or a passage. Like this section was bothering me so much, and I fixed the top part, and now I'm like so much happier with it. Remember, sometimes it's hard to fight the feeling that like, oh, this needs like an overhaul, something's like terminally wrong with this. But maybe it's just me, but I always have to remind myself like to not quite be so dramatic. But usually it's like a couple of minor things. I mean, sometimes it's not. I won't, you know, downplay that. But a lot of times it's just something needs to be modified. And often I feel like the frustration comes when, you know, seemingly a lot of things are right, so why does it feel wrong? Man, I just love painting. It's just those little touches and like, bam, it looks real. It's so funny that I just like was singing the praises of this brush and then I grabbed this other brush. I think for me, the reason I was so hesitant to teach for a while is because so much of painting is learning how to balance like choices just because they feel good versus like good, smart choices that will help you get to your goal and make your paintings better, and etc. You know, where I choose to move around in my painting is usually just a fever dream of like, I don't know, this part was bothering me. And, you know, as far as like brush selections, outside of like predominantly using outside of using brats and flats, the predominant thinking is really just what is speaking to me. And that's so hard to teach, because a lot of painting never, you know, don't forget, like you can take workshops all day long, you can go to the nicest art schools, and don't get me wrong, you can learn a lot from that. I take a lot of workshops and I really appreciate my very good art teacher from college, but so much of it is just learning how your own human animal works. What you like, what speaks to you, what feels good between your fingers when you're painting and, you know, rolling around your brush and just, you know, all that stuff. And it can be hard to teach that because, you know, how do you teach that? So I'll just leave you with this. Don't forget to honor that. If you want to do something because it feels good and you don't have a good reason, but it feels good, go for it. Another trick that I like to use is trying to figure out where else you can use a color, and not just to save money, but to create cohesion. So there's a theme of this like amber, yellowy gold popping up in multiple places in this composition. Here, here, the gold here. And you know, the benefit of doing that is it creates, again, that cohesion in the composition. And you know, it's just a helpful thing. You know, even if you have to fib it a little bit, even if it's like that gold is truly a different color of gold, which it's pretty close, but they're not the same, using the exact same color creates that illusion. You know, sometimes I feel like representational painters can forget from time to time that, you know, they're the boss, and even though they're a little beholden to what they're seeing in front of them, you control this universe. And if you want color to operate differently, then it can operate differently. I've been known, you know, I love guava. I love painting guava, the one with like the pink inside. But here in Texas, we only get the yellow guava, which they taste great. I love guava. They both taste really good. But I will fib in paintings and just make it pink guava because I prefer it personally. And so it's just things like that, you know, it's important to remind yourself, like, you can do that. Okay, after a quick camera-induced break, honestly, it's always kind of helpful to have an external reminder to take a break. It always feels like your motivation is being interrupted when you take a break, but it is good to stop even when you feel that momentum. Now, sometimes you really are getting somewhere, but sometimes you're kind of just like tunneling, and it's hard to know, you know, it's hard to explain which is which. I remember whenever I started painting earnestly years ago, my son was like 2 months old when I started painting daily. So it was in that first year, and needless to say, little children are a frequent interrupter. You know, it's their nature, it's fine. But I'm actually really grateful I went through a season where I was constantly sort of interrupted, as frustrating as it could be, because I actually think it helps you to be a better painter. In fact, advice I would have if you're someone who seems to kind of get sucked into the details is like set an alarm for every 20, 30 minutes and see if that helps you out. So, okay, we did the cigarettes, and now I'm going to, kind of lost where I was, but I know that this Motorola Razr is bothering me. Oh, and the pattern on the purse. Okay, so at this point things are resolved, but some of the thing that's making this feel not fully fleshed out is the white space. So at this point, this will be my third kind of attempt at using the white space to carve out. That's kind of the nice thing about not painting on pattern. You know, I love painting on a white surface because it really highlights the objects and shadow, and I've already mentioned that, but you know, one thing about the white background is that if you're newer, it can kind of give you not only a place to explore shadow, but it creates some simplicity, and it helps you to really figure out how to draw using the edge of the background. It doesn't have to be white. I would say maybe monochrome, but once again, I'm gonna go in here now with a smaller brush. If you've noticed a trend, the brushes get progressively smaller, and carve out and sharpen up some of this. And I'm always surprised how much heavy lifting that step does. So before I make a judgment call on what else needs to be resolved, I'm gonna do that and then check back in. Okay. I think it's done. Yeah. Okay, now this painting is complete. It's always kind of a surreal moment when you finally finish. You just feel like you're in the weeds for as long as possible. But yeah, it's got kind of the essence I was going for. It's got the cigarettes. I left some of the green. You know, it's hard for me to articulate with words after I'm done, which is why it's always like the worst whenever you finish a painting and then you want to post it to social media and you have to think of a caption. It's like that word part of your brain doesn't work. But you know, for this, I am pretty happy with it. I have painted obviously a similar subject matter. This is kind of, like I said at the top of the video, an extra from my book. A variation of this is in the book and you'll be able to see step by step of it. The book again is called Modern Still Life, from fruit bowls to disco balls. And this painting, I made sure to include cherries. I feel like maybe this is just me, but in like the late 90s, 2000s, cherries were everywhere. Like it feels like fruit kind of have seasons to them and more than just, you know, the time of the year they're selected. I don't know. And I feel like everything was like, it was like black cherry soda, like nail polishes, you know, black honey, black cherry. Anyways, so cherry were thrown in here because, you know, it's not a real still life unless you have fruit. Okay, I don't actually believe that, but this really tied it together. And this is fun. Hopefully it was informative to see all this come together. Just so you know, this isn't like a full how to paint video. These are demos where I'm going to talk through what I'm doing. And you know, whenever you pay for a workshop, I love attending other people's workshops. This is kind of what you're paying for. It's like a walkthrough, talk through, a little bit of like the step-by-step, but just mostly kind of talking through all the problems that sort of naturally arise, because all paintings have their problems. I've never had a painting that's just smooth sailing from start to finish, although some are more challenging than others. But yeah, I hopefully, again, you learned, you gained some insight. Feel free to leave questions down below, as always, and keep an eye out for my new book. Again, Modern Still Life, from fruit bowls to disco balls. I'm really proud of it. I worked on it all the second half of 2023 pretty diligently, and I could not be more proud. I put a lot of love into it. Not only is it step-by-steps, which I think again is a fantastic way to learn and to really see a painting come together, but I talk about all kinds of things, from how to troubleshoot, value, color. I talk about like how to stay motivated. You know, there's a little bit of that in there, which I'm really proud of, and so I will put a link to either order or pre-order the book, so you can check it out. But yeah, thanks for being here. Keep an eye out for the book, and happy painting.